The year was 1839, and Savannah, Georgia, was adorned with Spanish moss that draped from ancient oak trees like nature's own mourning veils. The clip-clop of horses' hooves and the occasional rumble of carriages echoed through the cobblestone streets. It was a time of prosperity for some, a dark paradox built upon the subjugation of others that stained the southern aristocracy's elegant facade. Among Savannah's elite families, none commanded more respect or whispered speculation than the Hollowbrooks. Their plantation, Willow Reach, sprawled across 500 acres of prime Georgia soil just beyond the city limits. The main house stood 3 stories tall, its white columns gleaming in the sunlight, its windows like watchful eyes surveying the vast cotton fields that had built the family's fortune. For members made up the Hollowbrook family. Thaddeus Hollowbrook, the patriarch, a stern man of 45 with piercing blue eyes that seemed to look through rather than at you. His wife Constance, 10 years his junior, whose porcelain beauty remained unmarred despite having borne 2 children. Their daughter, Eleanor, 19, whose musical talents and ethereal appearance had suitors lining up at their door. And finally, their son, William, 17, studious and reserved, more comfortable among books than people. What set the Hollowbrooks apart from other families of similar standing wasn't just their wealth or their prominence in Savannah society. It was their appearance. Despite the passage of years, none of them seemed to age. Constance Hollowbrook, in particular, was the subject of endless speculation among the ladies of Savannah's high society. At 35, she looked no different than she had at 25. Her skin remained unblemished, her honey blonde hair untouched by grey, her figure as lithe as a young woman's. "It simply isn't natural," Mrs. Abernathy whispered behind her fan to Mrs. Wellington during a garden party at the Prescott estate. "I swear to you, Constance Hollowbrook hasn't aged a day in 10 years. Not a wrinkle, not a line." "Perhaps it's the Carolina air they visit each summer," Mrs. Wellington replied, though her tone suggested she believed nothing of the sort. "Or perhaps," said Mrs. Abernathy, lowering her voice further, "it's something far less wholesome." The Hollowbrooks were aware of such talk, but paid it little mind. They maintained their position in society through careful cultivation of relationships, generous donations to the right causes, and by hosting the most elegant soirees in Savannah. Their annual midsummer ball was the highlight of the social calendar, an event no one of standing would dare miss, regardless of what they might whisper about their hosts behind closed doors. It was in early spring of 1839 that a stranger arrived in Savannah. He came on the evening stagecoach, a tall figure wrapped in a black traveling cloak. Despite the mild Georgia weather, he carried with him a single trunk and a large leather portfolio case. The stranger took a room at the River Street Inn, paying for a month in advance with gleaming gold coins that the innkeeper later claimed bore markings he'd never seen before. The stranger gave his name as Morris Blackwood. He claimed to be a portrait artist from Europe, seeking wealthy clients in America's prosperous South. His accent was difficult to place, not quite English, not quite continental, and when asked directly about his origins, he would smile enigmatically and change the subject. Within days, word of Blackwood's talent spread through Savannah society. The Pinckneys, wealthy merchants with new money and a desperate desire for acceptance, were the first to commission him. When their portrait was unveiled at a small gathering, the assembled guests gasped in genuine astonishment. Blackwood hadn't merely captured the Pinckneys' likenesses. He had somehow elevated them, smoothing Mrs. Pinckney's prominent nose, giving Mr. Pinckney a more dignified bearing than he possessed in life. Yet the portraits were unmistakably them, only better. "It's as though he's painted not just what we are," Mrs. Pinckney gushed, "but what we ought to be." More commissions followed. The Harrisons, the Dupants, the Caldwells, all wanted Blackwood's magic touch to immortalize them. His fee was substantial, $500 for a family portrait at a time when many men earned less than $1 a day, but no one questioned it. The results, everyone agreed, were worth every penny. Thaddeus Hollowbrook was not a man easily impressed by fads or fashions. He viewed the excitement over this new artist with skepticism. However, Constance had attended the Pinckneys' unveiling and returned home, insistent that they too must commission Blackwood. "The man has a gift, Thaddeus," she said as they sat in the library after dinner, the spring evening air drifting through open windows. "His paintings capture something essential about his subjects." Thaddeus peered at his wife over his brandy glass. "We've had portraits done before. That dreadful man from Charleston who made you look like you'd been sucking lemons. And that foppish fellow from New York who turned me into a simpering dandy." Constance laughed, the sound like silver bells. "This is different. Blackwood sees people as they truly are, or perhaps as they wish to be seen. Either way, the results are remarkable." "And expensive, I hear," Thaddeus grumbled. "Since when has expense been a concern for the Hollowbrooks?" Constance asked, one delicate eyebrow raised. Thaddeus couldn't argue with that. The cotton plantation had made them wealthy beyond most men's dreams, and their careful investments had only increased that wealth. $500 for a portrait was a trifle. "Very well," he conceded. "Invite your Mr. Blackwood to Willow Reach. We'll see if he's as talented as everyone claims." Morris Blackwood arrived at Willow Reach on a Tuesday morning in April. The dogwoods were in bloom, their white flowers standing out against the green of the formal gardens that surrounded the plantation house. Blackwood came in a hired carriage, dressed in a black suit that was well-cut but slightly old-fashioned in style. He carried his portfolio and a wooden case containing, he explained, his paints and brushes. "I prefer to mix my own pigments," he told Constance as she showed him to the drawing room where the sitting would take place. "Commercial paints lack vitality." "How fascinating," Constance replied, genuinely interested. "And where do you obtain your materials?" Blackwood smiled, his teeth very white against his olive-toned skin. "From various sources, Mrs. Hollowbrook. Some are quite common, linseed oil, white lead, while others are more specialized. Family secrets, you understand." "Of course," said Constance, though she didn't understand at all. The first sitting was for the entire family. Blackwood arranged them carefully, Thaddeus standing behind a seated Constance, Eleanor to her mother's right, William to her left. The pose was traditional, but there was something in the way Blackwood positioned them, a slight turn of the head here, a subtle placement of a hand there, that felt deliberate in ways none of them could articulate. "Remain still if you please," Blackwood instructed as he began sketching on a large canvas. "The initial composition is crucial." For 3 hours they held the pose, breaking only when young William complained of a cramp in his leg. Blackwood was accommodating but insistent. "The lighting must be consistent," he explained. "The mood must be maintained." By the end of the first session, Blackwood had produced only a rough sketch in charcoal, the basic shapes and positions of the family members. He would return, he said, for individual sittings with each family member to capture their features in detail. "I prefer to work this way," he explained to Thaddeus as the older man examined the sketch with a critical eye. "The family composition first to establish relationships and balance, then individual portraits to capture the essence of each subject." "Seems inefficient," Thaddeus remarked. "Art cannot be rushed, Mr. Hollowbrook," Blackwood replied smoothly, "especially not when one is attempting to capture not merely appearances, but souls." Thaddeus raised an eyebrow at this, but said nothing. He had built his fortune on practicality and had little patience for artistic pretensions. Still, he had agreed to this commission, and he would see it through. Over the next 2 weeks, Blackwood returned to Willow Reach daily. He spent a day with each family member individually, then the remaining time working on the collective portrait. He was a peculiar man, the family agreed privately. He rarely spoke unless spoken to, and when he did converse, he seemed to choose his words with meticulous care. He never discussed his past or his training, deflecting personal questions with practiced ease. Most strange were his habits while painting. He would sometimes stop in the middle of a brush stroke, his head tilted as though listening to a voice no one else could hear. He refused to allow anyone to watch him apply certain pigments to the canvas, insisting that they leave the room for short periods, and he kept a small silver box on his person at all times, occasionally opening it to remove what appeared to be a fine powder, which he mixed into his paints with ritualistic precision. "I don't trust him," Thaddeus confided to Constance one night. "There's something not right about the man." "He's an artist, dear," Constance replied dismissively. "They're all eccentric, and you must admit, the portrait is coming along beautifully." This was true. Even in its unfinished state, the Hollowbrook family portrait was remarkable. Blackwood had captured them with uncanny accuracy, Thaddeus's commanding presence, Constance's serene beauty, Eleanor's dreamy grace, William's thoughtful intensity. Yet, there was something more in the painting, something that went beyond mere physical resemblance. It was as though Blackwood had somehow painted the family as they saw themselves in their most private moments. On the final day of work, Blackwood arrived earlier than usual. He seemed tense, his normally steady hand showing a slight tremor as he set up his materials. "Today, we complete the work," he announced. "I will need absolute privacy for the final steps. The application of the last layers is delicate. A family secret handed down through generations." Thaddeus frowned. "This is my home, Mr. Blackwood. I don't typically allow strangers free rein in it." Blackwood turned to him, his dark eyes intense. "Do you wish for a masterpiece, Mr. Hollowbrook, or merely a competent likeness? What I do in these final hours will make the difference." After a moment's consideration, Thaddeus nodded curtly. "Very well. You may have your privacy, but know that my houseman will be right outside the door." "As you wish," Blackwood replied with a slight bow. The family left him alone in the drawing room. The doors were closed, and true to his word, Thaddeus instructed the houseman, a loyal servant named Jenkins, to remain in the hallway. Hours passed. Occasionally, Jenkins reported hearing strange sounds from within, mutterings in a language he didn't recognize, the clink of glass vials, and once what he swore was a sound like distant singing, though he could make out no words. As the sun began to set, Blackwood finally emerged. He looked exhausted, his face drawn, a sheen of sweat on his brow despite the mild temperature, but his eyes gleamed with satisfaction. "It is done," he announced. "The portrait may be viewed after it has rested for 24 hours. The final glazes must set undisturbed." "Rested?" Thaddeus echoed skeptically. "It's a painting, not a roast." Blackwood's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Every creation has its requirements, Mr. Hollowbrook. 24 hours. Then you may remove the cloth I have placed over it." "Not before. The oils are sensitive at this stage." He refused their invitation to stay for dinner, claiming fatigue. Before departing, he presented Thaddeus with a small leather-bound book. "Care instructions," he explained. "The painting will require certain considerations to maintain its unique properties." "Seems overly complicated for a portrait," Thaddeus remarked, though he accepted the book. "It is no ordinary portrait," Blackwood replied, "as you will soon discover." With those cryptic words, and after receiving his payment in full, Maurice Blackwood departed Willow Reach. None of the Hollowbrooks would ever see him again. The following evening, the family gathered in the drawing room for the unveiling. The covered portrait stood on an easel in the center of the room, illuminated by the warm glow of oil lamps. Outside, a spring storm had blown in from the coast, and rain lashed against the windows while thunder rumbled in the distance. Rather dramatic weather for our unveiling, Constance remarked, trying to lighten the mood. There was a strange tension in the room, though none of them could have explained why. "Let's get on with it," Thaddeus said. He approached the easel and with a swift motion pulled away the black velvet cloth that covered the canvas. For a long moment, no one spoke. They simply stared at the portrait in stunned silence. It was magnificent, beyond magnificent. It was uncanny. Blackwood had captured them with such precision that the painted figure seemed almost ready to step out of the frame. The colors were vibrant yet harmonious, the composition perfect, the brushwork so fine that even up close it was difficult to see individual strokes. But it wasn't just the technical excellence that rendered them speechless. It was what Blackwood had captured in their expressions, their postures, their eyes. He had painted them not just as they appeared to the world, but as they appeared to themselves. Thaddeus's hidden insecurities beneath his stern exterior. Constance's carefully concealed willfulness behind her serene smile. Eleanor's secret passions beneath her proper demeanor. William's ambition lurking behind his scholarly facade. "It's us," Eleanor finally whispered. But how could he know? "Know what, dear?" Constance asked, though her voice sounded strained. "How we are when no one is looking." Eleanor replied softly. Thaddeus cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable with his daughter's observation. "It's just a painting, albeit a very good one. The man has talent. I'll grant him that. Worth every penny." But even as he spoke, Thaddeus couldn't take his eyes off his own image in the portrait. The subtle suggestion of doubt in the set of his painted mouth, the hint of fear in eyes that he had always believed projected only strength and authority. "Where shall we hang it?" Constance asked, breaking the spell. They decided on the central wall of the drawing room, where the portrait would be visible to all visitors, a testament to the Hollowbrook family's prominence and taste. Jenkins and another servant carefully hung the large canvas, ensuring it was perfectly level. "It truly is remarkable," Constance said as they stepped back to admire it in its permanent position. Almost like looking in a mirror. None of them could have known how prophetic those words would prove to be. The first change was subtle, noticed by Eleanor 3 weeks after the portrait was hung. She had been practicing the pianoforte in the drawing room when a strange sensation caused her to look up at the portrait. For a moment, just a moment, she thought she saw a difference in her painted face, a slight tightening around the eyes, perhaps, or a barely perceptible downturn of the mouth. She blinked, and the impression vanished. "Imagination," she murmured to herself, returning to her music, but she found her gaze drawn repeatedly to the portrait as she played, searching for that fleeting change she thought she'd seen. A week later, William made a similar observation. He had been reading by lamplight in the drawing room when a movement seemed to catch his eye. He looked up at the portrait, startled. Had his painted self just shifted position? No, impossible. Yet he could have sworn that the angle of his painted head was slightly different. The expression in the eyes more intense. William approached the portrait cautiously, lamp in hand. He examined it closely, but in the flickering light he could detect no definitive change. Still, a sense of unease settled over him, and he found it difficult to concentrate on his book afterward. Neither Eleanor nor William mentioned these incidents to their parents or to each other. They seemed too fanciful, too easily dismissed as tricks of light or imagination. Yet, both found themselves watching the portrait when they thought no one was looking, waiting for another glimpse of something. It was Constance who first acknowledged the changes aloud. It happened during a small dinner party in early June, 2 months after the portrait was completed. The Wellmans and the Suttons had joined the Hollowbrooks for an evening of fine food and conversation. As they took after-dinner coffee in the drawing room, Mrs. Wellman was admiring the portrait. "It's exquisite work," she said. Though I must say, Mrs. Hollowbrook, the artist has taken some liberties with your appearance." Constance stiffened slightly. "Whatever do you mean, Margaret?" Mrs. Wellman gestured toward the portrait with her fan. "Why, he's painted you with those tiny lines at the corners of your eyes. What the French call crow's feet, I believe. Most unflattering. You have no such lines in person." Constance's coffee cup froze halfway to her lips. She stared at Mrs. Wellman, then at the portrait. It was true. Her painted image now showed fine lines around the eyes that had not been there when Blackwood completed the work. Subtle, yes, but unmistakable to anyone who studied the portrait closely. "An artistic choice, perhaps," Constance said faintly, setting down her cup with a hand that trembled slightly. "A poor one, if you ask me," Mrs. Wellman continued, oblivious to Constance's discomfort. "If I were paying such a handsome sum for a portrait, I would expect the artist to flatter rather than age me." The conversation moved on, but Constance remained distracted for the remainder of the evening. After their guests had departed and the household had retired for the night, she returned to the drawing room alone, a single candle in hand. In the wavering candlelight, she studied her painted face intently. The lines were there, delicate but definite at the corners of her eyes. Lines that she herself did not have, lines that had not been in the portrait when it was first unveiled. "It's not possible," she whispered to the empty room. But even as she denied it, Constance noticed other subtle changes, a slight softening of her painted jawline, a barely perceptible slackening of the skin beneath her chin. Her painted self was aging in ways that she, the living Constance Hollowbrook, was not. She thought of Blackwood's parting words, "It is no ordinary portrait," and the leather-bound book of care instructions that Thaddeus had tossed carelessly into a drawer, dismissing it as artistic affectation. Constance found the book in Thaddeus's study the next morning. It was small, bound in dark red leather that felt unusually warm to the touch. The pages were made of a material that wasn't quite paper, thinner, more like parchment with a slight translucence. The text was handwritten in a flowing script, the ink a deep brownish red. The first page bore a single title, "The Living Portrait." Below it, an inscription, "What is given must be paid for. Youth for age, life for life, as it has always been." Constance's hands trembled as she turned the pages. The text was often cryptic, written in an archaic style that made full comprehension difficult, but certain passages stood out with terrifying clarity. "The portrait lives as you live, ages as you do not. It bears the burden of time that has been lifted from your shoulders. The exchange cannot be undone. To destroy the portrait is to reclaim that which it has taken, all at once, with interest compounded. The portrait must be maintained in the familial home. Distance weakens the bond but does not break it. Separation of more than 100 miles will cause complications. Should the portrait be damaged, the damage will not be reflected in the living subject, but the injury to the bond will create imbalance. This must be avoided at all costs." Constance closed the book, her mind reeling. It was madness. Of course, portraits didn't age in place of people. Such things belonged to folklore and penny dreadfuls, not to the rational world of 1839 Georgia. And yet she had seen the changes in the portrait with her own eyes. And there was no denying that she herself had not aged visibly in years, nor had Thaddeus or their children. They had attributed it to good living, to the clean country air, to the Hollowbrook Constitution. They had ignored the whispers in Savannah society, the sidelong glances, the speculation. Constance returned the book to its drawer without mentioning it to Thaddeus. She needed time to think, to observe, to be certain before sharing such an outlandish theory with her pragmatic husband. Over the next few months, the changes in the portrait became more pronounced and more difficult to ignore. Thaddeus's painted hair began to show threads of grey at the temples. Eleanor's painted complexion lost some of its youthful dewiness. William's painted jaw became more defined, his boyish softness giving way to mature angles. And all the while the real Hollowbrooks remained unchanged. If anything, Constance thought they looked younger, more vital. Thaddeus had remarked that his old knee injury no longer troubled him, even in damp weather. Eleanor's seasonal cough, which had plagued her since childhood, did not make its usual appearance. William, always quick-witted, seemed to absorb and process information with even greater speed and retention. They were thriving while their painted selves withered. The correlation was impossible to dismiss. It was William who next discovered the book of instructions. Unlike his father, he read it thoroughly, his scholarly mind piecing together the implications of the cryptic text. When he confronted his mother, Constance was not entirely surprised. Of all her family, William was the most observant, the most likely to notice and investigate the portrait's strange properties. "It's some kind of witchcraft," William said, his voice hushed, despite the privacy of his mother's sitting room where they met. "This man, Blackwood, he's done something to us through that portrait." "Not to us, William," Constance corrected gently. "For us. The portrait ages so we don't have to. It bears our years, our infirmities." William paced the small room, the leather-bound book clutched in his hand. "But at what cost, Mother? Such things don't come freely. There's always a price." "The price was paid," Constance said. $500, a considerable sum. William gave her a look that made him seem far older than his 17 years. "You know that's not the kind of price I mean." And she did know. Somewhere deep inside, in a place she didn't care to examine too closely, Constance understood that what was happening was profoundly unnatural. Against God's design, some would say, a perversion of the natural order. But wasn't aging itself a kind of perversion, the deterioration of the body, the dulling of the mind, the gradual surrender to infirmity and death? If they had somehow been granted a reprieve from that cruel process, was it not a blessing rather than a curse? "We should destroy it," William said abruptly. "Burn it before it's too late." Constance felt a chill at his words. "The book warns against that. It says that to destroy the portrait is to reclaim all that it has taken, with interest compounded. I believe it means that all the aging it has absorbed for us would return at once. Better to age normally than to live under the influence of such unnaturalness," William argued. "And what of your father?" Constance countered. "And Eleanor? Are you prepared to make that decision for them as well? To rob them of this gift?" William had no answer for that. After a long silence, he handed the book back to his mother. "I don't like it," he said simply. "It feels wrong." "Many blessings appear strange at first," Constance replied. "Give it time, William. Observe. Think. Isn't that what your father always tells you? Don't rush to judgment without all the facts." Reluctantly, William agreed to keep their discovery between them for the time being. They would watch the portrait, document its changes, and seek to better understand what Blackwood had done before taking any irrevocable action. For a time, life at Willow Reach continued in its pleasant rhythm. The summer of 1839 gave way to fall, and the portrait continued its gradual transformation. The changes remained subtle enough that visitors either didn't notice them or attributed any differences to their own faulty memories. The Hollowbrooks themselves grew accustomed to the slow metamorphosis of their painted selves, even as they enjoyed their own seemingly arrested development. It was in late October that the first real discordant note sounded in their strange arrangement. Thaddeus had gone to Charleston on business, a journey of some 70 miles from Willow Reach. He had made such trips regularly for years without incident. But on the third day of his absence, Eleanor discovered her mother in the drawing room, staring at the portrait with a look of horror. "Mother, what is it?" Constance pointed a trembling finger at the portrait. "Look at your father." Eleanor looked. The painted Thaddeus now sported not just grey at his temples, but fully silver hair. Deep lines carved his forehead and bracketed his mouth. His painted shoulders stooped slightly as though bearing an invisible weight. "He's aged months in days," Constance whispered. "And he's not even here to absorb the benefit." Eleanor looked from the portrait to her mother, confusion evident in her expression. "I don't understand. What benefit?" Constance realized her slip too late. She had not yet shared the portrait's secret with her daughter, unsure how the romantic, somewhat superstitious girl would react. Now faced with this alarming development, she had no choice but to explain. Eleanor took the news with surprising calm. Unlike William's skepticism and moral qualms, Eleanor seemed to accept the portrait's magical properties almost readily. "I knew there was something special about it," she said, studying her own painted face with new interest. "I could feel it watching me." "Not watching, dear," Constance corrected. "Changing. Aging, so we don't have to." "But why is Father's image aging so rapidly now?" Constance hesitated, then retrieved the book from its hiding place. She showed Eleanor the passage about distance weakening the bond but not breaking it. "Your father is in Charleston, nearly 100 miles away. The portrait still ages for him, but without him here to, I don't know, receive the benefits directly. The process seems accelerated. Will he return looking older then?" Eleanor asked, alarmed. "I don't know," Constance admitted. "The book isn't clear on all aspects of the process." They didn't have to wait long for an answer. Thaddeus returned 2 days later, and to their relief he appeared unchanged, still robust, still vigorous, his hair still dark and full. But the painted Thaddeus now looked like a man in his 60s rather than his 40s, withered and grey. Constance could no longer keep the secret from her husband. That night, after the children had retired, she showed him the book and explained her theory about the portrait. To her surprise, Thaddeus didn't dismiss her ideas as fanciful nonsense. He listened intently, his expression growing darker as she spoke. "I knew there was something unnatural about that man Blackwood," he said when she had finished. "I felt it from the first. And now he's entangled us in some form of devilry." "Is it devilry to remain young and healthy?" Constance asked. "Is it not a blessing to be free from the ravages of time?" Thaddeus paced the bedroom, his movements agitated. "Nothing comes without a price, Constance. Nothing. And especially not something that defies the natural order so completely." "We paid his fee," Constance said, echoing her earlier argument to William. $500. "Don't be naive," Thaddeus snapped. "If what you're suggesting is true, if this portrait is somehow aging in our stead, then the true cost is yet to be revealed." Constance had no response to that. Deep down she shared his misgivings. Yet the prospect of perpetual youth, of escaping the decline that awaited all mortals, was too seductive to reject outright. "What would you have us do?" she asked finally. "Destroy the portrait? The book warns that doing so would cause all the aging it has absorbed to return to us at once." Thaddeus frowned. How much could it have absorbed in just half a year? A few months of aging, perhaps? We could withstand that. And if we wait, Constance asked, if we allow it to continue for years, decades, what then? The question hung in the air between them, unanswerable and terrifying in its implications. "We need to find this man, Blackwood," Thaddeus decided. "Make him undo whatever sorcery he's worked on our family." But Morris Blackwood had vanished from Savannah as completely as if he'd never existed. Inquiries at the River Street Inn revealed that he had checked out the very day he completed the Hollowbrook portrait, leaving no forwarding address. No one in Savannah society had heard from him since, and letters to art dealers in Charleston, New York, and even London yielded no information on his whereabouts. As 1839 drew to a close, the Hollowbrooks found themselves in a peculiar limbo. They could not undo what had been done, nor could they pretend ignorance of their situation any longer. The portrait continued its gradual transformation, the painted figures aging day by day, while the living Hollowbrooks remained frozen in time. William grew increasingly troubled by their situation. He spent hours researching arcane subjects in his father's library and made several trips to Savannah to consult with a scholar of folklore at the newly established medical college. He shared his findings with the family during a tense dinner in early December. "It's not unprecedented," he explained, pushing his barely touched food around his plate. "There are stories, legends of similar arrangements throughout history, portraits or statues that age or decay while their subjects remain youthful." Legends, Thaddeus emphasized. Fairy tales. As is a portrait that ages while its subjects do not, William countered, "Yet here we are." "What happens in these legends?" Eleanor asked, leaning forward with interest. "To the people who don't age." William hesitated, glancing at his mother. Constance nodded slightly, encouraging him to continue. "It varies," he said carefully. "In some stories, they live extraordinarily long lives, appearing eternally youthful while generations pass around them. In others, he trailed off. In others, Thaddeus prompted. In others, there comes a reckoning, William finished quietly. The debt of years must eventually be paid. How? Constance asked, though part of her didn't want to know. Usually through some catastrophic event. The portrait is damaged or destroyed, and the subjects age rapidly, sometimes dying in the process. Or the subjects begin to exhibit other unnatural qualities, an inability to eat normal food, aversion to sunlight or religious symbols, unnatural appetites. Vampirism, you mean? Thaddeus said bluntly. William nodded reluctantly. In some versions of the stories, yes. Eleanor gasped softly. Are we to become vampires then? Of course not, Constance said firmly. These are just stories, Eleanor. Our situation is unique. All situations described in folklore were unique ones, William pointed out, before they became part of the collective narrative. Thaddeus pushed back from the table abruptly. Enough. I won't have this kind of talk at my dinner table. We are not characters in a ghost story. We are the Hollowbrooks of Willow Reach. Whatever this situation is, we will address it rationally. But rationality seemed increasingly inadequate as the months passed and the portrait's transformation continued. By the spring of 1840, a year after Blackwood had completed his work, the differences were stark. The painted Hollowbrooks now appeared approximately 10 years older than their living counterparts. Thaddeus's painted self had fully grey hair and deeply etched lines on his face. Constance's painted beauty had faded, her skin beginning to show the creep-like texture of advancing age. Eleanor's painted vivacity had dimmed, her posture less sprightly. William's painted scholarly intensity had hardened into something more severe, more haunted. Meanwhile, the actual Hollowbrooks remained not just unchanged, but improved. Thaddeus found that old battle wounds from his military service no longer troubled him. Constance, who had always suffered from mild digestive complaints, discovered that she could now eat anything without discomfort. Eleanor's occasional melancholy, which had sometimes kept her abed for days, vanished entirely. William's weak eyesight strengthened to the point that he no longer needed his spectacles for reading. They were becoming more perfect physically, even as their moral discomfort with the situation grew. It was Eleanor who first noticed the next unsettling development. She had been arranging flowers in the drawing room when a movement in the portrait caught her eye. She looked up sharply, certain this time that she had not imagined it. Her painted self had moved, had turned its head slightly to watch her. For a long moment, Eleanor stood frozen, staring at the portrait. The painted figures looked back, their expressions no longer the careful poses Blackwood had originally captured, but something new, something aware, something hungry. Eleanor fled the room, not stopping until she reached the safety of her bedchamber. There she collapsed onto her bed, her heart racing. Had she imagined it? Was her mind playing tricks, influenced by William's talk of folklore and supernatural bargains? But deep down, Eleanor knew what she had seen. The portrait was no longer merely changing. It was awakening. She kept the observation to herself for several days, returning to the drawing room at different times to surreptitiously observe the portrait. Sometimes she thought she caught another slight movement, a flicker of the eyes, a twitch of the lips. Other times, the painted figures remained still, though she could not shake the sensation of being watched. It wasn't until she noticed her brother engaged in the same surveillance that she confided in him. "You've seen it too," she said quietly, coming to stand beside William as he stared at the portrait one afternoon. It wasn't a question. William nodded, not taking his eyes from their painted images. They move when they think no one is watching. I've seen them shifting position, exchanging glances. What does it mean? Eleanor whispered. I don't know, William admitted. None of the stories mention this specific development, but I fear it's not a positive sign. They agreed to tell their parents. Thaddeus and Constance received the news with grim expressions, but little surprise. I felt it watching me, Constance confessed. I thought it was my imagination. We should destroy it, Thaddeus said, not for the first time. Whatever the consequences, they can't be worse than this abomination in our home. The book warns against destruction, Constance reminded him. All the aging it has absorbed would return to us at once. After more than a year, William calculated, that would be significant. Potentially fatal for father, who has aged the most in the portrait. Then what do you suggest? Thaddeus demanded. That we continue living with this thing, watching it watch us, letting it feed on our years like some kind of parasite. No one had an answer. The situation deteriorated rapidly after that. The portrait's movements became more pronounced, more deliberate. Sometimes the family would enter the drawing room to find the painted figures in subtly different positions than they had been earlier. Once a housemaid claimed to have heard whispering coming from the empty drawing room, only to find the painted figures with their heads inclined toward each other as if in conversation when she investigated. Servants began to refuse to enter the drawing room alone. Visitors commented on the portrait's lifelike quality with nervous laughter. The Hollowbrooks found themselves avoiding the room whenever possible, even as they felt a strange compulsion to check on the portrait regularly. And through it all, the living Hollowbrooks continued their unnatural non-aging, their perfect health, their increasing vitality, even as a sense of wrongness, of violation grew within them. By midsummer of 1840, the painted figures appeared nearly 20 years older than their living counterparts, the aging process seemingly accelerating. Thaddeus's painted self now looked like an old man, stooped and frail. Constance's painted beauty had withered entirely, her skin sagging, her eyes rheumy. Eleanor's painted youth had fled, leaving a middle-aged woman with bitter lines around her mouth. William's painted scholarly intensity had calcified into something cruel and hard. And still they moved, still they watched, still they whispered when no one was in the room, or so the family believed, though none of them had actually caught the painted figures in the act of speaking. The crisis came in August during the hottest part of the Georgia summer. A season of drought had left the countryside parched, the crops struggling, the air thick with dust and pollen. Tempers throughout the region were frayed, and the atmosphere at Willow Reach was particularly strained. The family had gathered for dinner, a silent, tense affair punctuated only by the clink of silverware against china. No one had much appetite. No one had much to say. The portrait's increasingly disturbing behavior weighed on all their minds, an unspoken presence at the table. It was Jenkins who interrupted the meal, his normally composed face flushed with alarm. "Sir," he addressed Thaddeus. "There's something happening in the drawing room." Thaddeus rose immediately, followed by the rest of the family. They hurried to the drawing room where an impossible sight greeted them. The portrait was changing before their eyes. Not the slow, gradual transformation of the past 16 months, but a rapid, visible metamorphosis. The painted figure seemed to ripple and shift, their features flowing like wax in a fire. And as they watched in horror, the painted figures began to change in a new way. No longer simply aging, but transforming. The painted Thaddeus's stern features twisted into a mask of cruelty, his eyes gleaming with malice. The painted Constance's serene beauty hardened into cold disdain, her lips curled in a sneer. The painted Eleanor's dreamy grace corrupted into something wanting and predatory. The painted William's thoughtful intensity blazed into fanatical madness. They were becoming not just older versions of the Hollowbrooks, but darker ones, manifestations of their worst potential selves, their hidden flaws and secret sins magnified and made manifest. And as the family watched, frozen in horrified fascination, the painted figures turned their heads in perfect unison to stare directly at them. No longer was there any pretense of being mere paint on canvas. The eyes that looked out at them were alive, aware, and filled with malevolent purpose. The painted Thaddeus's mouth opened, and a voice that was both his and not his, older, raspier, but with unmistakable echoes of his authoritative tone, emerged from the canvas. "We hunger," it said simply. Eleanor screamed. Constance clutched at her husband's arm. William took an involuntary step backward. Only Thaddeus held his ground, though his face had gone pale. "What are you?" he demanded of the portrait. The painted figure smiled in unison, a terrible expression that held no mirth. "We are you," the painted Constance replied, her voice a dry rustle like dead leaves. "We are what you would be, what you should be, what you will be. We bear your years," the painted Eleanor added, her once sweet voice now sultry and corrupted. "We bear your decay, your decline, your mortality, and we tire of it," the painted William finished, his scholarly diction twisted into something pedantic and cruel. "We tire of aging while you remain pristine. We tire of withering while you flourish. What do you want?" Thaddeus asked, his voice remarkably steady despite the impossibility of the situation. The painted figures exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. Then the painted Thaddeus spoke again, his withered lips barely moving. "We want to be free." A chill swept through the room despite the summer heat. Free. The word hung in the air, pregnant with menace. Free. How? Constance asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Free of the canvas," the painted Eleanor explained, her aged eyes gleaming. "Free of the frame. Free to walk in the world again." "Again?" William echoed. "You've never walked in the world. You're paint and canvas. Nothing more." The painted figures laughed in unison, a sound like glass breaking. "Are we?" the painted William countered. "Or are we something else entirely? Wearing the shapes Blackwood gave us?" And suddenly, horribly, understanding dawned on the Hollowbrooks. The portrait wasn't simply aging for them. It wasn't merely absorbing their years. It was housing something else. Something that had been bound to the canvas through Blackwood's art. Something that had been feeding on their stolen time. "What are you?" Thaddeus demanded again, his voice cracking now. "We told you," the painted Thaddeus replied. "We are you. Or rather, we will be you once we're free." "You can't leave the canvas," William stated, though he sounded far from certain. "You're bound to it. That's how the magic works." "Every binding has its breaking point," the painted William responded. "Every prison its weakness. We've grown strong on your stolen years, and now we're strong enough." As if to demonstrate, the painted Thaddeus raised his hand, and the real Thaddeus's arm jerked upward in a mirror movement, his face registering shock and fear. "You see," the painted Constance purred, "the connection works both ways. We age for you. You move for us. A fair exchange, wouldn't you say?" Constance tried to back away, but found her feet frozen in place. The rest of the family likewise discovered they could not move, could not flee. They could only stand and watch as the painted figures began to change again, their forms becoming less distinct, more fluid, as though the very pigments that composed them were dissolving. "What's happening?" Eleanor cried, tears streaming down her face. "They're coming through," William whispered, understanding and terror mingling in his voice. "They're breaking free indeed." The portrait seemed to bulge outward, the canvas stretching as though something were pressing against it from within. The painted figures were no longer distinct individuals, but a swirling mass of color and form, pushing, straining against the confines of the frame. "We must destroy it," Thaddeus managed to say, fighting against the invisible force that held him in place. "Now, before it's too late. If we destroy it, we'll age all at once," Constance reminded him, panic edging her voice. "It could kill us. Better to die as ourselves than to let those things take our places," Thaddeus growled. With tremendous effort, he managed to take a single step toward the fireplace, where a fire burned despite the summer heat, a concession to Constance's fondness for the cheerful light. Another step, another, each movement a battle against invisible restraints. The portrait's surface bulged further. A hand, gnarled and spotted with age, beginning to push through the canvas like a grotesque birth. "Hurry, father!" William urged. Thaddeus reached the fireplace and seized a burning brand. With a hoarse cry, he hurled it at the portrait. For a terrible moment, it seemed the brand would miss its target, but then it struck the canvas squarely, and flames erupted across the surface. The reaction was immediate and horrifying. The painted figures shrieked in unison, a sound beyond human vocalization, more akin to the wailing of damned souls. The bulging canvas receded, the emerging hand withdrawing as the flames spread rapidly across the portrait. But even as the painted horrors retreated, a new agony began for the living Hollowbrooks. Constance collapsed to the floor, her hands clutching at her face as lines appeared on her previously flawless skin, spreading like cracks in thin ice. Eleanor cried out as her lithe form seemed to thicken slightly, her movements less fluid. William gasped as his vision blurred, the world suddenly less distinct without the perfect sight he had enjoyed for the past year. And Thaddeus fell to his knees as his dark hair silvered before their eyes, as deep lines carved themselves into his face, as decades of aging rushed upon him in moments. The portrait burned with unnatural intensity, the flames an eerie blue-green that cast ghastly light throughout the drawing room. And from within the fire, the painted figures made one last attempt at freedom. Their faces, now barely recognizable as human, pressed against the burning canvas from within, their mouths open in silent screams, their eyes fixed on the aging Hollowbrooks with furious hunger. But the fire was too swift, too thorough. Within minutes, the portrait was reduced to ashes. The ornate frame charred beyond recognition, and with its destruction, the invisible bonds that had held the family in place vanished. They collapsed where they stood, exhausted and forever changed. When the servants, who had fled in terror at the portrait's animation, cautiously returned to the drawing room, they found a transformed Hollowbrook family. Thaddeus appeared to have aged 20 years in an instant, his hair white, his face deeply lined, his once powerful frame diminished. Constance, though still handsome, had lost her uncanny, ageless beauty, fine lines marking the corners of her eyes and mouth. Eleanor and William, too, showed subtle signs of maturing, though as the youngest, they had been less affected by the portrait's influence and subsequent destruction. No one outside the family ever learned the full truth of what happened that August night in 1840. The official explanation was that a fire had broken out in the drawing room, destroying the valuable family portrait, a great loss, but merely material. The Hollowbrook's suddenly aged appearance was attributed to the shock of the event or to the fact that their previous youthfulness had been exaggerated in social gossip. Privately, the family came to terms with their experience in different ways. Thaddeus, most dramatically aged by the ordeal, became deeply religious in his remaining years, attending church services faithfully and funding the construction of a new chapel on the grounds of Willow Reach. Constance, stripped of her supernatural beauty but still a handsome woman for her age, redirected her energies toward charitable works, establishing a foundation to support orphan children in Savannah. Eleanor, sobered by the experience, abandoned her more frivolous pursuits in favor of serious study, eventually publishing several well-regarded volumes of poetry under a pseudonym. And William, whose scholarly interests had previously tended toward the arcane and esoteric, devoted himself to medicine, becoming a respected physician known for his rational approach to healing. As for Morris Blackwood, he was never seen or heard from again in Georgia. But stories occasionally reached the Hollowbrooks of a traveling portrait artist in other parts of the country, New Orleans, St. Louis, Boston, whose work was said to capture his subjects with uncanny accuracy, and who charged exorbitant fees for his services. The descriptions never quite matched the man they had known, but the results of his work, as described in breathless letters from distant acquaintances, were unmistakably similar. The Hollowbrooks never commissioned another family portrait. The space on the drawing room wall where Blackwood's creation had hung remained empty for a generation, a silent reminder of their brush with forces beyond human understanding. Years later, when all the original Hollowbrooks had passed away, having lived normal mortal lifespans after their extraordinary interlude, William's son found a small leather-bound book among his father's effects. The pages were brittle with age, the strange script faded but still legible. On the inside cover, in his father's precise handwriting, was an inscription: "Some bargains appear too good to refuse, but nothing that defies the natural order comes without cost. Time will have its due one way or another. Let this stand as warning to future generations of our family." The young man read the book with growing disbelief, dismissing it as the product of an aging mind's fancy or perhaps material for one of his Aunt Eleanor's Gothic poems. He placed it in the library at Willow Reach, where it was eventually forgotten among thousands of other volumes. But occasionally guests at Willow Reach would comment on a strange sensation in the old drawing room, a feeling of being watched when no one was present, or of catching movement from the corner of one's eye, only to find nothing there when turning to look. And sometimes in the right light at the right angle, one might almost discern the faintest outlines of figures on the empty wall, faded impressions of a family portrait long destroyed, like a scar that never fully heals. For the Hollowbrooks had learned what Morris Blackwood had always known, that time is not merely a progression of moments, but a force in its own right. It can be diverted, delayed, even transferred, but never truly cheated. In the end, time collects its debt from all living things, one way or another. And in the hidden corners of the world, artists like Blackwood continue their work, offering their special services to those willing to pay the price, not just in gold, but in something far more precious. The secret of their art is passed down through generations, a dangerous knowledge that balances precariously between miracle and monstrosity. For what is given must be paid for. Youth for age, life for life, as it has always been. The portrait ages, the subject does not, until the day of reckoning comes, as it must for all who dare to defy the natural order, as it did for the Hollowbrooks of Willowreach that hot August night in 1840, when their portraits, having aged instead of them, finally demanded their freedom.